Jackson Reed stood at the altar, his jaw clenched tight as he stared at the church doors that hadn't opened yet. In 10 minutes, he'd be married to a woman he'd spoken to exactly 3 times. A woman the whole town called the Old Maid. A woman who had no more choice in this arrangement than he did. The banker's cold ultimatum echoed in his mind like a death sentence. Marry within the month or lose the ranch. Behind him, he could hear the whispered gossip of the townsfolk who'd orchestrated this whole mess. They thought they knew what was best for him, for his motherless daughter, for his failing ranch. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. Just 2 weeks ago, Jackson had been sitting in Banker Morrison's office, hat in hand, begging for more time. The drought had killed half his cattle, and the remaining herd wasn't enough to cover his debts. "I've got a solution for you, Reed," Morrison had said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The town committee has been discussing your situation. You need a wife to help raise that little girl of yours, and your ranch needs a woman's touch. We found the perfect candidate." Jackson had laughed bitterly. "I buried my wife 6 months ago, Morrison. I'm not looking for another one." But Morrison's next words had crushed that defiance. "Then you'll be burying your ranch too. Marry by month's end, or I call your loans." All of them. The committee had presented their solution the very next day. Mrs. Henderson, the town's self-appointed matchmaker, had marched into his kitchen with a triumphant smile. "Jackson Reed, meet your salvation. Lillian Hartwell has agreed to marry you." Jackson had stared at the stern-faced woman standing behind Mrs. Henderson. Lillian Hartwell was 28 years old, which made her practically ancient by frontier marriage standards. She'd been the town's schoolteacher for 3 years, ever since arriving from Boston under mysterious circumstances. The children respected her, but she intimidated grown men with her sharp tongue and sharper mind. She was tall, serious, and completely wrong for him in every way imaginable. What Jackson didn't know was that Lillian had her own demons chasing her west. 3 years ago, she'd been engaged to Boston's most eligible bachelor, only to discover he was already married. The scandal had destroyed her reputation overnight. Her father, a respected doctor, had died of shame within months. With nowhere else to turn, she'd answered an advertisement for a frontier schoolteacher, hoping to disappear into the vast Wyoming territory. She'd built a new life teaching children whose parents could barely read themselves, but she'd never quite escaped the whispers that followed her from town to town. Damaged goods, they called her, too proud for her own good. And now, at 28, she was facing her own ultimatum. School board chairman Williams had cornered her after classes just yesterday. "Miss Hartwell, the town's decided you need a husband. It's not proper, a woman your age living alone." Some folks are starting to talk. Lillian had straightened her spine the way her Boston finishing school had taught her. "My personal life is no one's business, Mr. Williams." But Williams had shaken his head. "This is a small town, Miss Hartwell. People talk, and when they talk, they make decisions. The school boards decided that unmarried women of a certain age aren't suitable teachers for impressionable children. You can marry Jackson Reed and keep your position, or you can find yourself on the next stage out of town." The choice, such as it was, had been made for her. Now, as the church doors finally creaked open, both bride and groom felt the weight of their shared imprisonment. Lillian walked down the aisle in a simple gray dress, her face set in an expression of quiet dignity that hid her screaming nerves. She looked neither left nor right, focusing only on the man waiting for her with obvious reluctance. Jackson watched her approach and felt a strange mixture of resentment and pity. They were both victims of this town's misguided good intentions. 2 broken people being forced together like pieces of a puzzle that would never fit. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of barely concealed tension. Reverend Matthews rushed through the vows, as if he sensed the explosive atmosphere in the room. Emma, Jackson's 2-year-old daughter, cried throughout the entire service from her place in the front pew, as if she somehow understood that this stranger was about to change everything. When it came time for Jackson to kiss his bride, He barely brushed her cheek, and Lillian's face burned with humiliation. The congregation erupted in forced celebration, but the bride and groom stood like statues, trapped in their new reality. The reception in the church hall was worse than the ceremony. The townsfolk congratulated themselves on their matchmaking skills while the newlyweds sat at opposite ends of the head table, barely speaking. Perfect solution, Mrs. Henderson proclaimed loudly. Jackson gets help with little Emma, Lillian gets security, and the ranch gets saved. Everyone wins. Jackson's knuckles went white around his coffee cup. Everyone wins? He'd just sign away his freedom to save a ranch that might not even be worth saving. The ride to his ranch was conducted in deadly silence, with Emma whimpering in Lillian's uncomfortable arms and Jackson staring straight ahead at the dusty trail. When they finally arrived at his modest farmhouse, Lillian stepped down from the wagon and surveyed what was now supposed to be her home. The house was clean but sparse, clearly the domain of a man who'd given up on making things beautiful. Jackson carried their bags inside and turned to face his new wife with the enthusiasm of a man facing execution. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, his voice cold as winter wind. "This marriage is a business arrangement, nothing more. You'll have a spare room upstairs. I expect you to take care of Emma and keep the house running. But beyond that, we don't need to pretend this is anything other than what is." Lillian lifted her chin, her Boston education giving her a dignity that frontier life couldn't break. "Fine by me, Mr. Reed, but I have conditions too. I'll need access to books and writing materials. I won't be treated like a servant in this house. And if I'm going to care for your daughter, I'll do it my way, not yours." They stared at each other across the small living room. Two proud people who'd been backed into corners they never saw coming. Emma chose that moment to start crying again, reaching her tiny arms toward her father and away from this strange new woman. Jackson took his daughter with visible relief, and Lillian felt something crack inside her chest. Even a 2-year-old could sense she didn't belong here. "I didn't ask for this," Jackson said quietly, bouncing Emma in his arms. Lillian straightened her shoulders and picked up her single carpet bag. "Neither did I, Mr. Reed. But we're both here now, aren't we?" She climbed the stairs to her new prison, leaving Jackson alone with his daughter and his regrets. Neither of them had any idea that this forced beginning would lead to the greatest love story their small town had ever seen. The first week of marriage felt like the longest 7 days of both their lives. Jackson and Lillian moved around each other like enemy soldiers in a ceasefire, each determined to prove they didn't need the other. Lillian threw herself into reorganizing the entire house with the efficiency of a general planning campaign. She rearranged the kitchen, sorted through closets, and established routines that made sense to her educated mind. Jackson responded by undoing her changes whenever possible, moving things back to where they'd been when his late wife Sarah was alive. It was petty and childish, but it was also the only control he had left in his own home. Emma became an unwilling battleground between them. The little girl sensed the tension and began acting out in ways that broke Jackson's heart. She would cry whenever Lillian tried to feed her, throw her toys when Lillian attempted to play, and cling to her father with desperate intensity whenever he tried to leave for ranch work. Lillian, for her part, approached childcare like a complex mathematical problem that could be solved with enough logic and patience. She read to Emma from educational books, tried to establish proper meal times, and attempted to teach basic manners to a 2-year-old who just wanted her daddy and her real mama. "She doesn't like me," Lillian said quietly one evening as Jackson took a screaming Emma from her arms after another failed dinner attempt. Jackson bounced his daughter gently, feeling her tiny body relax against his familiar chest. "She's just adjusting," he replied, though they both knew it was more than that. Emma represented everything they'd both lost: Jackson's happy marriage, Lillian's dreams of having her own children with a man who actually loved her. Every interaction with the little girl reminded them that they were both just playing roles they'd never auditioned for. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night when Emma's persistent fussiness turned into something much more frightening. Jackson had just finished the evening chores and was looking forward to his one beer of the day when he heard Lillian calling his name with an urgency that made his blood run cold. He found him in Emma's small bedroom, Lillian holding his daughter with a competence that surprised him. Emma's face was flushed bright red, her tiny body burning with fever, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. "How long has she been like this?" Lillian asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Jackson's hand shook as he touched Emma's forehead. She was fine at dinner, maybe a little cranky, but he trailed off, remembering Sarah's death, how quickly things had gone wrong, how helpless he'd felt watching his wife slip away. "We need to get her to Doc Williams in town," he said, already reaching for his coat. But Lillian's hand on his arm stopped him. "The storm's getting worse out there. Look outside, Jackson. We'd never make it through that snow, and the cold air would make her condition worse." Jackson looked out the window and felt his heart sink. The wind was howling like a banshee, and snow was falling so hard he could barely see the barn. They were trapped, just like they'd been trapped into this marriage, but this time a life hung in the balance. "Then what do we do?" he asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. Lillian was already moving, laying Emma gently on the bed and rolling up her sleeves. "My father was a doctor in Boston. I helped her with patients for years before." She didn't finish the sentence about her scandal, but she didn't need to. "I know what to do, but I'll need your help." What happened next broke down the first wall between them. Lillian took charge with a quiet authority that impressed Jackson despite himself. She sent him to fetch cool water and clean cloths while she gently undressed Emma to help bring down the fever. She mixed a solution from ingredients in her medical kit, things Jackson hadn't even known she'd brought with her. "Keep talking to her," Lillian instructed as she worked. "Let her hear your voice. Children fight harder when they know their parents are there." Jackson found himself talking to Emma in a soft, steady stream, telling her about the horses, about the cattle, about how much he loved her. And somewhere in that long, frightening night, he became aware that Lillian was talking too, her voice mixing with his in a gentle chorus of encouragement. She sang lullabies in what sounded like Latin, told stories about brave little girls who conquered dragons, and whispered prayers in a voice that shook with genuine emotion. For the first time since their wedding, Jackson saw past her stern exterior to the woman underneath. As dawn broke, Emma's fever finally broke too. Her breathing became steady and deep. Her face returned to its normal color, and she slept peacefully for the first time in days. Jackson slumped in his chair, exhausted but grateful, while Lillian continued to monitor their patient with professional dedication. "She's going to be fine," Lillian said softly, and Jackson heard something in her voice he'd never heard before: maternal love. Not duty or obligation, but genuine care for his little girl. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. Lillian looked surprised, as if she'd expected him to dismiss her efforts. "Your father taught you well." She smiled for the first time since their wedding, and Jackson was startled to realize she was actually quite pretty when she wasn't wearing her armor of stern disapproval. He used to say that healing was about more than medicine. It's about caring enough to fight for someone, even when the odds seem impossible. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with new meaning. Later that morning, as Emma played quietly with her toys and showed no lasting effect from her illness, Jackson and Lillian found themselves sharing coffee and actually talking. Not the polite, stilted conversations they'd been forcing, but real communication about real things. "I came west because my pregnant sister needed help," Lillian admitted, staring into her cup. She was having a difficult pregnancy, and her husband had died in a mining accident. "I thought I could make a difference, but by the time I got to Colorado, she'd lost the baby and remarried. I was unnecessary." Again, Jackson studied her face, seeing vulnerability where he'd only seen pride before. "I never wanted to marry again," he confessed. "Sarah and we had something special. I thought marriage was supposed to be about love, not convenience or survival. Lillian nodded slowly. In Boston, I thought I'd found that kind of love. I was wrong. He was already married, just forgot to mention it until after I'd accepted his proposal and told everyone we knew. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd been betrayed by life in different ways, but had ended up in the same place. The ranch is failing, Jackson said suddenly, surprising himself with his honesty. Bad investments, drought, predatory loans. Even if this marriage saves it temporarily, I don't know how long we can hold on. Lillian set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. I'm good with numbers, Jackson. Better than most men, if I'm being honest. Maybe I could take a look at your books. Jackson's first instinct was to refuse. His pride bristled at the idea of his unwanted wife managing his affairs. But then he remembered how she'd taken charge during Emma's crisis, how competent and calm she'd been when he was falling apart. These numbers don't add up, Lillian said 3 hours later, looking up from his ledgers with a frown that made Jackson's stomach clench. Jackson, I think someone's been stealing from you. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Jackson felt the ground shift under his feet once again. First a forced marriage, now this. But as he looked at his wife, and for the first time, the word didn't feel like a curse, he realized he wasn't facing this crisis alone anymore. Whether he'd wanted it or not, he had a partner now. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Lillian spent the next 3 days buried in Jackson's financial records, and what she found made her angrier than she'd been since discovering her fiancé's lies back in Boston. The numbers told a clear story of systematic theft, but it was so cleverly done that Jackson never would have caught it without her trained eye. Banker Morrison had been skimming money from Jackson's accounts for over 2 years, covering his tracks with false fees, inflated interest charges, and phantom service costs. The drought and cattle losses were real, but they should never have pushed Jackson to the brink of losing his ranch. Look at this, Lillian said, spreading the ledgers across the kitchen table as Jackson came in from his morning chores. Her finger traced a series of entries with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Morrison charged you for cattle feed deliveries that never happened. Here, and here. 3 separate occasions, totaling over $400. And these loan fees? I've seen banking contracts in Boston, Jackson. These percentages are illegal, even out here. Jackson leaned over her shoulder to study the documents. And for a moment, they've both forgot their awkward marriage in the face of shared outrage. The closeness was impossible to ignore. Jackson caught the scent of her hair, something clean and floral that reminded him there was still beauty in the world. Lillian felt the warmth of his body behind her and had to force herself to concentrate on the numbers instead of the way her heart was beating faster. They've been working together like this for days now, their heads bent close over paperwork, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed documents back and forth. Something was changing between them, something neither was ready to name. We need proof that will hold up in court, Lillian said, her voice slightly breathless from his nearness. I can build a case, but we'll need witnesses, documentation, maybe even testimony from other ranchers he's cheated. Jackson straightened up, putting some necessary distance between them. Morrison's been the only banker in town for 15 years. People trust him. Who's going to believe he's been stealing? But Lillian's smile was sharp as a blade. People will believe evidence, Jackson, and I know exactly how to present it. They worked late into the night, building their case with the methodical patience of hunters tracking dangerous prey. Jackson found himself watching Lillian as she worked, amazed by her intelligence and determination. She made notes in precise handwriting, cross-referenced dates and amounts, and built a timeline that would have impressed any big city lawyer. This was a side of her he'd never imagined. Not just educated, but brilliant in a way that made him wonder what she might have accomplished if the world hadn't tried to crush her spirit. You should have been a lawyer, he said during a break, when they were sharing coffee and the comfortable silence of two people working toward the same goal. Lillian laughed, but there was sadness in it. Women can't be lawyers in Boston, or anywhere else for that matter. The best I could hope for was to marry one and help him behind the scenes. She paused, looking down at her hands. I used to help my father with his medical practice the same way. All the intelligence, none of the credit. Jackson felt a surge of anger at a world that would waste such a sharp mind simply because it belonged to a woman. The confrontation came on a Friday morning when Morrison was holding his weekly office hours. Jackson and Lillian walked into the bank together, carrying their carefully prepared evidence like ammunition. Morrison looked up from his desk with a false smile he'd perfected over years of cheating honest people. Well, the newlyweds. How's married life treating you, Reed? I trust your wife is keeping you in line. The condescending tone made Jackson's jaw tighten, but Lillian placed a calming hand on his arm. Mr. Morrison, Lillian said, her voice carrying all the authority of her Boston education. We're here to discuss some discrepancies in my husband's accounts. She opened their folder and began laying out documents with the precision of a general deploying troops. These charges for cattle feed that was never delivered. These inflated loan fees that exceed territorial legal limits. These mysterious service charges that appear nowhere in your standard rate schedule. Morrison's face went pale, then red, as he realized what he was looking at. Now see here, Mrs. Reed. Morrison blustered, trying to regain control of the situation. Banking is complicated business. A woman wouldn't understand. But Lillian cut him off with a look that could have frozen hell itself. A woman whose father was a doctor and whose fiancé was a lawyer understands perfectly, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether you'd prefer to discuss this privately or in front of Judge Harrison. The banker's bluster died in his throat as he realized he was facing someone who could match him move for move. What followed was a masterpiece of controlled fury and intellectual superiority. Lillian presented each piece of evidence, while Jackson stood behind her like a fortress, his presence lending physical weight to her words. Morrison tried to deny, deflect, and intimidate, but every argument crumbled under the weight of Lillian's preparation. When other townspeople began gathering outside the bank, drawn by raised voices, Morrison's resistance finally collapsed. Fine, he said, his face gray with defeat. I'll adjust the accounts. Full restitution. But Lillian wasn't finished. Full restitution, all fraudulent charges removed, and a public apology to everyone in this town you've been cheating. Because Jackson wasn't your only victim, was he? The banker's silence was answer enough. When they finally emerged from the bank, Jackson felt like a man who'd been holding his breath for 2 years and could finally breathe again. The victory celebration that night was the first time they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Emma, sensing the changed atmosphere, actually let Lillian help feed her without fussing. Jackson opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion that he'd thought would never come. To brilliant women and second chances, he toasted, and Lillian felt something warm bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the wine. I couldn't have done it without you, she said, surprising them both with her honesty. In Boston, I would have had to work through a man, let him take all the credit. Here, we were partners. Jackson looked at her across the table, really looked at her, and saw not the stern schoolteacher or the unwanted wife, but a remarkable woman who'd just save his ranch and possibly his daughter's future. We make a good team, he said quietly, and the way her eyes lit up made his heart do something complicated in his chest. 3 months into their strange marriage, something had fundamentally shifted. Emma began calling Lillian Mama Lily without being prompted, running to her with scraped knees and requests for stories. The ranch was not just surviving, but beginning to thrive under their joint management. Neighbors who'd initially gossiped about the arranged marriage now spoke admiringly of how well they worked together. You'd never guess they didn't choose each other, Mrs. Henderson said to anyone who'd listened, as if she hadn't orchestrated the whole thing herself. But it was the small moments that revealed the deepest changes. The way Jackson started looking forward to coming home. knowing Lillian would be there with her quiet intelligence and unexpected humor. The way Lillian caught herself humming while doing household tasks, something she hadn't done since before her world fell apart in Boston. The way they'd both find excuses to work on ranch business together, their conversations stretching longer and ranging farther from cattle and accounts to dreams and fears and the thousand small thoughts that make up a life. One evening, as they sat reviewing plans for expanding the ranch's operations, their hands accidentally touched over the same document. Neither pulled away immediately, and for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, they looked into each other's eyes and saw something that had nothing to do with business arrangements or forced marriages. Jackson felt his heart racing like a schoolboy's, while Lillian's carefully constructed walls began to crack. They were playing with fire now, and they both knew it. The question was whether they were brave enough to get burned. The town dance was their first public appearance as what looked like a real couple, and Jackson found himself surprisingly nervous as he helped Lillian down from the wagon. She'd borrowed a blue dress from their neighbor, and with her hair softened around her face instead of pulled back severely, she looked nothing like the stern woman he'd married 3 months ago. Other men in town noticed too, and Jackson felt an unexpected stab of jealousy when Tom Fletcher asked her to dance. "She's beautiful tonight," Mrs. Henderson commented, watching Lillian glide across the dance floor. Jackson nodded, surprised by how proud he felt. "She's always been beautiful," he replied, then caught himself. When had he started thinking of her that way? When they danced together, her hand in his felt natural, right in a way that scared him. "We're getting good at this," she murmured, close enough that her breath tickled his ear. "At what?" he asked. "Pretending to be happy," she said, but her smile suggested maybe they weren't pretending anymore. The evening shattered when they returned home to find Emma screaming in her bed, thrashing against invisible terrors. "Mama!" the little girl cried, reaching desperately toward the ceiling. "I want my real mama." Jackson rushed to comfort her, but Emma pushed him away, her 2-year-old heart breaking with confusion she couldn't express. Lillian stood in the doorway, watching the scene with tears streaming down her face. "She doesn't want me," Lillian whispered, her voice cracking. "She never will. I'm just the woman you were forced to marry, not her real mother." Jackson had never seen her vulnerable like this, her Boston strength crumbling under the weight of a child's innocent honesty. "I don't know how to be what she needs. I don't know how to be what anyone needs." She turned to leave, but Jackson caught her hand. "Emma's not the only one who lost someone," he said softly, pulling her back into the room. "You lost the life you planned, the man you loved, the family you thought you'd have. But you've given us more than you know." He guided her to sit beside Emma's bed. "Tell her about the stars like you did when she was sick." Lillian's voice shook as she began the gentle story she'd made up about brave little star princesses, and gradually Emma's sobs quieted. As Emma finally fell asleep between them, Jackson and Lillian found themselves really looking at each other for the first time. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Lillian said quietly. "What wasn't?" Jackson asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "This feeling, this caring about you both so much it hurts." Her honesty hit him like a punch to the chest, because he'd been fighting the same impossible truth. "I told myself it was just gratitude," Jackson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved Emma. You saved the ranch. You saved my whole life. But it's more than that now." He reached out tentatively, touching her cheek where tears had dried. "I've fallen in love with my own wife, and I don't know what to do about it." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. Lillian leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as years of loneliness cracked open in her chest. "In Boston, I thought I knew what love was. It was flowers and poetry and pretty promises. This is different. This is choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. This is..." She opened her eyes and met his gaze directly. "This is real." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, nothing like the brief peck at their wedding altar. This was a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. What happens now? Lillian asked when they broke apart, both breathing hard. Jackson looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully between them, then back at his wife's face in the moonlight. Now we stop pretending this is just an arrangement. Now we choose each other, for real this time. The smile that bloomed across Lillian's face was brighter than all the stars she told Emma about, and Jackson knew their real love story was just beginning. 3 weeks after their first real kiss, Jackson surprised Lillian by proposing again, this time with his mother's ring and words that came from his heart instead of legal obligation. They held their own private ceremony in the meadow behind the house, with Emma as their flower girl and the setting sun as their witness. This time it's our choice, Jackson said as he slipped the ring on her finger, and Lillian felt tears of joy instead of resignation on her wedding day. Their happiness lasted exactly 2 days before the past came calling. Jackson's late wife's parents, the Weatherbys, arrived unannounced with a lawyer and a legal document that made Jackson's blood run cold. "We're here for Emma," Mrs. Weatherby announced, her Boston accent sharp with disapproval. "Our granddaughter shouldn't be raised by some arranged marriage stranger when she has proper family who can provide for her." The custody petition claimed Jackson was unfit due to financial instability and his hasty remarriage to an unsuitable woman. "They can't take her," Lillian said fiercely once the Weatherbys had left to take rooms at the hotel. Her protective instincts surprised even her with their intensity. "Emma is our daughter now." But Jackson's face was gray with fear. They have money, lawyers, connections, and they're not wrong about the arrangement. How do we prove to a judge that this marriage is real when it started as a business deal? The question hung between them like a sword, threatening everything they'd built. The legal hearing was set for the following week, giving them little time to prepare their defense. Word spread quickly through town, and Jackson was amazed to discover how many neighbors came forward to support them. Mrs. Henderson, who'd orchestrated their original marriage, testified that she'd never seen a more devoted couple. Doc Williams spoke about Lillian's medical skills and how she'd saved Emma's life during the fever. Even former enemies like Morrison, now facing his own legal troubles, grudgingly admitted that Jackson's ranch had prospered under their partnership. But it was Lillian herself who provided the most powerful testimony. Standing before Judge Harrison with her chin raised and her voice steady, she spoke with the passion of a mother defending her child. "Your Honor, I didn't give birth to Emma, but I've loved her through every nightmare, celebrated every new word, worried through every fever. Love isn't about blood, it's about choice. Every day, I choose to be her mother, and she chooses to be my daughter." Her voice broke slightly. "The Weatherbys can offer Emma money and social position. I can only offer her unconditional love and a home where she's wanted for herself, not as a replacement for someone they lost." Jackson followed with his own testimony, his rough rancher's words carrying more weight than any fancy lawyer's speech. "I married Lillian to save my ranch, but she saved my family. Emma was just surviving before. Now she's thriving. She calls Lillian Mama because that's what Lillian is, not by law or blood, but by love and choice." He looked directly at the Weatherbys. Sarah's parents want Emma to replace the daughter they lost. Lillian wants Emma to be exactly who she is, our little girl, safe and loved and home. The judge's decision came after 2 agonizing hours of deliberation. While the court recognizes the Weatherbys' genuine concern for their granddaughter's welfare, the evidence clearly shows that Emma Reed is thriving in her current home. The marriage between Jackson and Lillian Reed, regardless of its origins, has created a stable, loving environment. Custody remains with the natural father and his wife. Emma stayed with them, but the battle had taken its toll. That night, as they held each other in their bed, sharing a room now by choice rather than necessity, Jackson and Lillian finally understood what they'd built together. "They tried to prove our marriage was fake," Jackson murmured against her hair. "Instead, they proved it was the realest thing in this whole town." Lillian smiled in the darkness. "We're not the same people who stood at that altar 6 months ago." "No," Jackson agreed, pulling her closer. "We're better. We're choosing each other every single day, and that makes us stronger than any marriage that started with love but never had a fight for it." 1 year after their forced wedding, Jackson Reed stood on his front porch watching his wife teach their daughter to braid wildflowers, and he could barely remember the man he'd been before Lillian came into their lives. The ranch that had been failing was now thriving beyond his wildest dreams. The cattle were healthy and multiplying, new pastures had been cleared and planted, and the books showed a profit that would have seemed impossible just months ago. But more than financial success, the ranch had become a real home, filled with laughter, purpose, and the kind of deep contentment he'd thought died with his first wife. Lillian was 5 months pregnant now, her belly round with their first child together, and the sight of her never failed to take his breath away. She'd abandoned the severe hairstyles and dark dresses of her spinster days, embracing softer colors and letting her hair fall in gentle waves around her face. But the biggest change wasn't in how she looked, it was in how she carried herself. The defensive walls she'd built in Boston were gone, replaced by the confident grace of a woman who knew she was loved and valued for exactly who she was. "Mama Lily, look," Emma called out, now 4 years old and bursting with the personality that had been suppressed during those difficult early months. She held up a crown of daisies and dandelions, beaming with pride. "It's for the new baby." Lillian's face lit up with genuine joy as she admired Emma's handiwork. "The baby is so lucky to have such a creative big sister," she said, and Jackson felt his heart swell with pride and love for both his girls. The transformation in Emma was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The anxious, clinging child who'd cried through their wedding was now a confident, happy little girl who ran to Lillian with scraped knees and exciting discoveries with the same enthusiasm she showed Jackson. She'd forgotten that there had ever been a time when Lillian wasn't her mama, and the night terrors about her real mama had long since faded into peaceful sleep. Emma Reed was thriving in a way that proved love truly did make the strongest families. The school project had been Lillian's idea, born from watching the ranchers' children grow up with little formal education. "These children are just as bright as any Boston students," she told Jackson one evening as they planned their future. "They deserve the same opportunities." With the ranch's newfound prosperity, they'd built a small schoolhouse on their property, and Lillian taught not just Emma, but a dozen other ranch children from the surrounding area. Parents rode for miles to bring their children to learn from the Boston teacher, and Lillian had found a way to use her education to serve her community rather than feeling trapped by it. The town's attitude toward their marriage had shifted completely. What had started as a desperate arrangement orchestrated by meddling neighbors was now held up as the greatest love story anyone could remember. Mrs. Henderson took full credit, of course, telling anyone who'd listened that she'd known all along they were perfect for each other. "Sometimes people need a little push to find their destiny," she'd say with a satisfied smile, conveniently forgetting how reluctant both bride and groom had been at the altar. But it was the quiet moments that revealed the deepest changes. Jackson found himself sharing thoughts and dreams with Lillian that he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. She listened to his plans for expanding their cattle operation with the same attention she gave to Emma's rambling stories about her imaginary friend. In return, Lillian shared her own dreams, not just of teaching, but of writing books about frontier life, of helping other women find their place in this wild territory, of building something lasting that would outlive them both. Their physical relationship had blossomed from that first tentative kiss into something powerful and tender. Jackson marveled at how different this love felt from what he'd shared with Sarah, not better or worse, but uniquely theirs. With Sarah, love had been comfortable and familiar. With Lillian, it was passionate and challenging, built on mutual respect and shared struggles rather than easy compatibility. They'd earned each other through fire and hardship, and that made every moment together feel precious. The annual town celebration was approaching, and this year Jackson and Lillian had been asked to host the main dinner, a recognition of their status as one of the community's leading families. As they planned the menu and decorations, Lillian laughed about how nervous she'd been at their first social appearance. "I was so afraid everyone would see through us," she admitted. "Now I'm afraid they'll see too much. How ridiculously happy we are." Jackson pulled her into his arms, careful of her growing belly. "Let them see," he said. "Let them see what happens when two stubborn people stop fighting their fate and start fighting for each other." The evening of the celebration was perfect. Clear skies, warm air, and the kind of sunset that painted the whole world golden. Jackson watched Lillian move among their guests, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she chatted with neighbors and kept an eye on Emma, playing with the other children. She belonged here in a way she'd never belonged anywhere else, and everyone could see it. This was her place, her people, her purpose. As the evening wound down and their guests began heading home, Jackson found himself alone with his family on their front porch. Emma had fallen asleep in Lillian's lap, flower crown, slightly askew, completely content. The baby kicked strongly enough that Jackson could see the movement through Lillian's dress, eager to join their little family. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lillian asked softly, looking up at the stars. "Our wedding day?" Jackson considered the question seriously. "I think about how angry I was, how trapped I felt, how sure I was that my life was over." He paused, smoothing Emma's hair gently. "I was such a fool. My life wasn't ending. It was finally beginning." Lillian smiled, the same radiant expression that had been lighting up his world for months now. "The town forced us to stand at that altar, but everything that came after, that was our choice. Every day, we chose each other, and I'll keep choosing you," Jackson said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Every day for the rest of our lives." He looked out over their thriving ranch, their happy daughter, his pregnant wife, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the stubborn community that had refused to let two broken people stay broken. They thought they were solving a practical problem, a failing ranch and an unmarried woman. Instead, they'd created something beautiful beyond imagining. Years later, when people told the story of Jackson Reed and the schoolteacher he'd been forced to marry, they always ended the same way. She was supposed to be just a convenient wife, but she ended up owning his heart completely. And Jackson would smile when he heard it, because it was absolutely true. Lillian Hartwell had come to Wyoming as society's leftover, the old maid nobody wanted. But she'd become the cornerstone of not just his family, but their entire community. As they sat on their porch that night, Jackson realized that the greatest transformations often begin with the word no. He'd said no to love again, no to trusting another woman with his heart, no to believing he deserved happiness. Lillian had said no to settling, no to being seen as damaged goods, no to believing her dreams were finished. But sometimes the most important no is just the beginning of the most beautiful yes of your life. And their yes to each other, to their family, to the love they'd built from nothing, was a story worth telling for generations to come.